Welcome back. Welcome back to Living in Mexico. I'm Ana Maria Salazar. Thank you. Thank you so much for joining us once again. It's an honor to be with you every weekend since 2005. So thank you. Thank you so much for joining us. This was a really interesting week, not only because what is happening at the border right now. And if you've been following the different news outlets and headlines in Mexico and in the United States, you know that Title 42 ended this week, and there's been a lot of confusion. What does that mean for the border, migrants trying to cross into Mexico? What does it mean for security on the border? But also this week, there continues to be a lot of back and forth between Mexico and the United States in regards to the fentanyl crisis. This is another crisis. And of course, it is also related to the border. Senator Kennedy during a hearing at this week, where they were literally grilling the head of DEA. He made some of this terrible, horrendous comments regarding Mexico. And it's almost offensive even to repeat it, but he basically said that if it wasn't for the United States, people in Mexico would pretty much be eating cat food out of a can and living in tents. And of course, there was reactions from the Mexican government and different, policymakers in Mexico and regarding these comments. But at the end of the day, it also kind of highlights this friction that is taking place between policymakers in the United States and their view they have in regards to Mexico and Mexico's role on immigration and controlling the crossing of fentanyl. But this just raises some basic question, and this is an issue that I've been trying to address not only on this show, but also on my TV show, Gabinete de Seguridad, is trying to really understand what is Mexico's role in the fentanyl crisis and the trafficking of fentanyl to the United States. To talk about this, joining me today, and this is the first time I believe he's joined us here on Living in Mexico, is Steve Dudley. He is the co-founder of a think tank called Inside Crime, which basically is just kind of dedicated to thinking about organized crime in Latin America and in Mexico. And Steve, welcome to the show. I've been following the website and the reports that are published on your website very, very closely. I want to congratulate you. And there's a couple of these reports that specifically address fentanyl issues in Mexico, including precursors, organized crime. Welcome to the show, Steve.
Thank you. Thank you very much for having me, Ana Maria.
So let's just jump in. I have to ask you, can you just, at least from your perspective, describe to our audience, what is the role of Mexico in either producing fentanyl or, trafficking fentanyl? Because there continues to be not only a certain level of confusion, but at least it appears that publicly that the U.S. government and the Mexican government can't even agree what is Mexico's role in the fentanyl crisis. Do they produce fentanyl? They just traffic fentanyl? Welcome to the show. Describe to us. What do you know?
Thank you. Well, obviously, it's this is criminal activity, so this isn't an exact science. But what we can say is that, I think we probably have to push back a little bit so people understand this process. Fentanyl is a synthetic drug. It relies on certain ingredients. These ingredients are very often called precursors. And in the simplest terms, these precursors are essentially just part of a recipe. When we refer to precursors, that is the sort of end stage of the recipe. So very often you are getting a whole bunch of different chemicals that you need in order to produce fentanyl. And the issue at stake here seems to be, as far as we can tell, of when and what kinds of chemicals different criminal groups are getting in Mexico before they're then sent on to the United States. So before, it used to be they would get the finished form of fentanyl, and they would get it in two forms. You get it in powder form, or you get it in counterfeit pill form. What they would do with that is then send that to the United States either in this powder form, which would then most likely get produced, sort of put into the pill presses, counterfeit pills, and then sold on the street as sort of counterfeit Oxycontin or counterfeit Xanax, those sorts of things. What has evolved over time, which is very similar to what we've seen with other synthetic drugs, most notably methamphetamine, is that the Mexican groups are developing the capacity to manufacture fentanyl themselves. But they're not so sophisticated as the, chemistry producers or, large, manufacturing chemical producers in places like China yet. So they still need the sort of almost final stage precursors. And so it's a very simple process. They get the precursors from places like China, mostly China, but perhaps even India, Germany, United States, other places. And they get the almost final stage, precursors, basically. And then they move that with a few simple steps, a fairly simple recipe to finish fentanyl. They're not producing from scratch the fentanyl, but they're kind of at the final stages and then producing that into fentanyl and then trafficking that fentanyl to the United States. The reason it gets confusing is because in the case of meth, for example, they're basically producing it from scratch. And in the case of fentanyl, they're much further along. It's as if somebody gave you like a cookie recipe and they had already done the dough, and you're basically, shelving out the cookies and then putting them on the sheet and then putting them into the oven. So it's the difference between making the cookies from scratch, or, it's probably a terrible, metaphor, just because we're, not eating cookies here, we're eating fentanyl.
Right.
But you get the idea. And so what the Mexican authorities are trying to do is kind of thread this needle and say, we're not producing this from scratch, we're getting kind of end stage, synthetic precursors. And then those precursors are then going into fentanyl. There's another thing that's happening, which is that there is a recognition on some levels of the Mexican government that this is happening. But on the very highest levels, on the AMLO level, he is just obstinate. He is just saying that this is by no means happening. And the lower levels, you get the sense that, they kind of know it's happening, but they don't want to say it out loud. They don't want to say the quiet part out loud, that this is happening, and happening in very, to a very great degree. How much? It's very hard to say. There's still fentanyl being produced in places like China and India that is then diverted or produced illegally. Sort of, they have a long history in China of having these kind of night shifts where they have been producing, fake counterfeit drugs and drug supplements for decades. So it's not surprising that they would use these kind of night shifts to also produce fentanyl. The amount of fentanyl that they need in order to satisfy US consumption is minuscule compared to other drugs, because it is so potent. We're talking about minuscule amounts. So it's very easy to camouflage also in the exports and imports. It's very easy to camouflage, within the sort of larger, huge chemical industry that global chemical industry that exists. So it is very difficult to detect and interdict and try and stop from the supply side. So that makes it even more frustrating, is nobody really has good eyeballs on this. They don't really, they can't really see how this is happening. I mean, we get little indications,
right.
But it can move in such small amounts.
Let me ask you this then. I mean, one of the positions taken by the Mexican government is that there they seem to keep on insisting that they can't find, or there is no fentanyl labs. And, last week, the Secretary of the Navy had this very controversial presentation at one of the morning press conference where he was contradicting reports by two TV stations, British TV stations, in regards to the images that we were seeing were images of not fentanyl labs, but rather I guess they would be methamphetamines or some kind of, there would be methamphetamines. I don't think they were saying they were cocaine labs. But I guess the issue is it really different than producing methamphetamines? And why is the U.S. government insisting that the Mexican government is not giving them information on meth labs? On fentanyl labs. Do you know what I mean? Because it just seems that everybody seems to be fighting on whether there's production or they're manufacturing. But at the end of the day, something is happening in Mexico, which translate in millions of pills trying to, be trafficked to the United States.
Yeah. First of all, there are news organizations that have made mistakes as it relates to fentanyl manufacturing. We've seen many reports, for example, that show finished fentanyl being pressed into pills. That's not manufacturing fentanyl. That fentanyl has already been produced, and it's just being pressed into pills. That is very often what they are seizing. They're seizing big pill presses. So that's definitely a confusion. But what we do believe is happening is that they are obtaining precursors, a very advanced stage of the chemical process. And then there are very small, the thing is that they can be in very small spaces in a garage or in a kitchen. This doesn't require a large amount of space, as it does in the case of methamphetamine, because methamphetamine is being produced from scratch. They are taking a number of what we call sort of essential chemicals, binders and dyes and other things that they need in order to do this. They have some what are called sort of precursors, which are less regulated than the precursors. And then they use those to manufacture precursors, which then get them to the methamphetamine. So you can see it's a much more complex process as it relates to methamphetamine. But in the case of fentanyl, they're almost already there. So in essence, they literally use to a great extent what's called the one pot method. They only need one pot in order to move it into the finished fentanyl. And then from that, then it goes to pill presses. But yes, in some instances, you are getting people who are mistaking, either a methamphetamine lab, for a fentanyl lab. But that is also the problem of the Mexican government. They don't disaggregate these labs in the seizure data that they give. They have very confusing and contradictory data that comes out from different institutions. There is, very little transparency on the part of the Mexican government as it relates to data about these particular seizures. So there is confusion, yes, on the part of the media. But in other instances, the media are getting it right. And I don't know what this particular naval officer was referring to in terms of the media, but in some instances, right. In some instances, it is wrong.
Well, let me ask you this. Is it that difficult to produce fentanyl from scratch? Why isn't there more reports of fentanyl being produced from scratch coming out of Mexico? Because it sounds that it's already pre-produced, or, they already have the cookie dough, the way they're importing the cookie dough. I'm using that metaphor that you used right now. From China, mainly from China. Is it that much more difficult to produce fentanyl from scratch? Is it why? What's the difference?
It's difficult. It's dangerous, and it is expensive. And probably most importantly, they don't need to do it. It is easier and cheaper for them to continue to source it somewhere else. in such quantities, they're having no problem sourcing this. So when they start having a problem sourcing this, sourcing these precursors, sourcing this cookie dough, then you'll see a much quicker evolution of them, figuring out how to produce it from scratch, or analogs or facsimiles thereof. It may not necessarily be of the same quality that they are getting by using these very advanced precursors that they're getting from Asia. But it'll go through a similar process as we saw with methamphetamine. When the sort of precursor supply was controlled to a much greater extent, and basically we're talking about pseudoephedrine and ephedrine. When that was controlled to a greater extent, and then they started control the next phase, which was what's called P2P. So they started using a slightly different method, and then that was controlled. The evolution and the speed of that evolution accelerated to the point now where they're not reliant. They are very self-sufficient as it relates to methamphetamine. The notion is, as those same controls become apparent in the fentanyl market, with those chemicals, with those chemical ingredients that they need, then that process will also accelerate. But at the moment, they are getting more than enough supply of the precursors and the precursors that they need in order to produce in the late stages the fentanyl that they need, to the extent that the price has dropped exponentially over the last few years, because there's a massive amount of supply. The reason there's a huge amount of supply and the price is dropping is because they are having no problems whatsoever sourcing these chemicals that they need. When that starts to happen, we'll start to see another process come about.
I have one last question. I'm literally running out of time. Based on what you've just said, then it kind of raises the question: why isn't these pre-cooked or fentanyl being introduced directly into the United States? Do we know, or do we have a sense how much of this process, or whether there is a production of fentanyl in the United States? I mean, they have all the, commerce between China and the United States is the largest in the world. It would seem quite easy to be able to put in some packets, or trying to bring in some of these, at least the using your metaphor again, the cookie dough into the United States. Why do they have to come to Mexico in order to put them, it sounds like they're putting them in pills form.
Yes. Well, there are various ways in which the cookie dough or the precursors are coming into Mexico before being manufactured into fentanyl. And one way is directly to Mexico, right? You just land in Mexico. It's in a large port, or it goes through the airport. These are the two main ways, right? Several airports, have been noted in Mexico as being entry points, but other ways are more indirect. It can be produced by, another company, a German company, let's say, and it can be diverted from legal supplies. It can go in through Guatemala, which is or other Central American countries, which have far lower controls as it relates to these chemicals, or some of the chemicals that they need. Or it can be sent clandestinely, and there are several cases like this, through the United States. So exactly what you're saying. There are cases in which it goes to the United States. These precursors go to the United States and then are smuggled, or basically sent down into Mexico, and then those precursors are used to manufacture fentanyl. So all of these different ways in which these precursors are arriving in Mexico are then contributing to the manufacturing process.
But they're not being manufactured. But they're not being manufactured in the United
States. No, the risks are just much higher in the United States as it relates to this. And as far as we can tell, the infrastructure and the know-how are probably less as well in the United States. So it's just easier to get the infrastructure. It's easier to manage infrastructure. It's easier to hide the infrastructure. There's far lower risk of doing the sort of mass production process that they're doing in Mexico than there is in the United States.
Steve Dudley from Insight Crime. I highly recommend our audience to go into the website. There's a series of fascinating reports that I think will be very useful in trying to understand, at least get a sense that there is information out there that would be very helpful in understanding what is the process and what is Mexico's role, and also very worrisome, because it sounds like that eventually Mexico will have the capability of producing, I mean, from scratch, some of the fentanyl, which would be, I think it's also going to be a game changer. But promise me
you come. This is the big takeaway, Ana Maria, which is that the overlap between the illegal and the legal in the synthetic drug market is like this. It's basically one over the other. And so in order to separate those two without harming the flow, the global flow of the chemical industry and the economies related to it is very difficult. So this is the big takeaway.
Wow. Come back soon. The website, can you remind our audience what's the website? Insightcrime.org. Is that correct?
There you go. Insightcrime.org.
.org. Steve Dudley, founder of this think tank, insightcrime.org. Thank you so much for joining us here and Living in Mexico, and hopefully you'll come back soon.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. We're going to go to commercial break. I'm Ana Maria Salazar. You're listening